I'm Rob.
And I'm Nate.
And welcome back to Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. This is week 3 of our Preston Sturges theme month, wherein Nate has selected the 1941 film Sullivan's Travels.
Yes, Sullivan's Travels, which is great, and which we'll get into at some length. It could be called, and has been called, obviously Preston Sturges was a brilliant man. Preston Sturges could have done any number of things with his life, and he did do earlier in his life a variety of things. This is his apologia, why I make comedy movies.
I wondered about that.
It even features basically a Preston Sturges type character in the lead, played by Joel McCrea. Joel McCrea was an interesting actor. He's known mostly for westerns, but he did some notable things. He was in Most Dangerous Game with Fay Wray back in 1932, which was about people hunting humans on an island, that old chestnut.
Yep.
It wasn't a particularly old chestnut yet. He was in really a good, forgotten Hitchcock film called Foreign Correspondent, which may be one of the best Hitchcock films you've never heard of. He was in a comedy called The More the Merrier with George Stevens, who I might have to tie some things back into George Stevens as this goes forward. And he will be in our film next week, The Palm Beach Story by Preston Sturges, as a Western director of a laconic bearing, or a Western actor of a laconic bearing. The joke in Hollywood was Joel McCrea is who you get when you can't get Gary Cooper.
Okay.
And this idea was floated to Preston Sturges. It's like, well, we can get you Gary Cooper, Preston. So if I wanted Gary Cooper, I'd have asked for Gary Cooper. I want Joel McCrea. And they got along famously, and they had a lot of respect for each other, and he's very effective in this film.
Yeah.
We should probably do a little introduction. It's been kind of fun to have me have you kind of summarize what this movie is about.
Well, Joel McCrea is John L. Sullivan, who is, as you mentioned, a director, Hollywood director, known for his comedies. And he has decided that he doesn't want to make another comedy. He wants to make a serious film about the, kind of the plights and the struggles of the human man, but he doesn't have enough experience to make the film. So he's decided he's going to go out as a down-on-his-luck person to learn about trouble and the difficulties people go through in life. So he sets out the first time and ends up right back in Hollywood, where he meets Veronica Lake, whose credited role is the girl. Mm-hmm. And he meets her at a diner, and she shows him kindness, and he's trying to repay the kindness, and she's not believing anything he says initially and things like that. And anyways, to finish the plot summary before we get into some of the details, they end up striking out together to fulfill his mission. And they become good friends along the way, really come to like each other. And then as Sullivan is wrapping up his exploits, he decides he's going to go down to this encampment and give these people that are down on their luck, $5 each. And one of the guys that he gives a $5 bill to, who's already stolen his shoes from him, runs ahead and hides and mugs him and knocks him out and throws him in a train car. And Sullivan, comes to as the train is coming into the train yard, which is a faux pas if you're jumping the train. And when he's confronted, he gets hit again, and he hits back. And so he's sentenced to 6 years hard labor and is really experiencing, the hardships, and has to come up with a plot to be able to get himself rediscovered and get back to civilization, which of course he eventually does, and is able to reunite with Veronica Lake. And things have worked out in his favor while he's down on his luck. And he has come to the conclusion, there's a scene where they go to a church and are watching just a Disney cartoon. And these guys in this who are in this encampment sentenced to hard labor are laughing. And it makes him come to the realization that it's okay for him just to make comedies, because sometimes that's just what the world needs.
Oh. This is a fantastic movie. This is even better than I remembered it being. and it's been more than 15. It's probably 2004-ish, I think, was the last time I saw this. It's been a real long time, but I remember, I think this was probably the first Preston Sturges film I saw, because it has such a great reputation, and I think it's the best thing he ever did. Like, there are movies that I kind of like more, you know, that kind of resonate, but in terms of an accomplishment, this is fantastic. And one of the things that it's great at is, and I've used this as an example for film doing this well, is handling changes in tone. Because this film is a broad comedy early on. It's delightful. It's got this wonderful cast of supporting players that Sturges
his familiar
like to move
characters,
in, especially William Demarest and Franklin Pangborn and Porter Hall and others.
Robert Craig.
Yeah, and when he gets caught, and he has brief amnesia, so he can't defend himself before he is sentenced to hard labor in what appears to be somewhere in the South, it becomes just existentially terrifying. Because this guy can't do anything to convince anybody, and he's being railroaded, and like the guy that runs this prison camp is the monster.
Yeah.
And the judge is an a-hole that sentences him with crappy, you know, it's like his defense was shit. And I hope, you know, it's a good thing that he came out of this happy, because if it were me, I'd be spending the rest of my life destroying the lives of the judge and the head of that prison camp, because of how awful they were to him. But
I suspect that he probably still did.
Probably still did. It's like, yeah.
Or at least the head of the prison camp.
Yeah, well, I think the press that they would have gotten, I mean, he just has to give an interview and say what happened to him, and probably destroy that man's career.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny how he plays that against the guy, because, you know, he's got his badge, and he's, you know, such a hard up. So all he does is, you know, the way he's discovered that he's John Sullivan is he figures out all he's got to do is get his picture in the paper. And so, because he's seen the newspaper that says Sullivan's been killed in a train yard accident, all he does is start shouting that he killed John Sullivan. And of course, the guy grabs him and takes him into town, and is making a big deal out of, I caught the murder of John Sullivan.
In the paper where he's just got this grin, like, look what I did! I caught the murderer!
Yeah.
And we never get to see that grin taken off his face, but it doubtless would have.
But that doesn't seem like it would fit with the plot and narrative of this film.
The narrative is that he transcends it. And he's like, what I am is good, and what I do makes people happy. Because there's that scene, we're kind of skipping to the end, but where the prisoners are taken in to watch a movie, and it starts with that Disney cartoon, a Pluto cartoon, and it's being shown at a black church in a bayou. I love that preacher.
Yeah.
Where he is talking to them about how don't anybody, we have less fortunate people that are coming in to enjoy our pleasure with us, and don't anybody make them feel awkward, and can we please clear the first three front rows
and put them kind of in a place of honor for
And this is just a ramshackle, poor black church in the South in 1941. And they're saying these are less fortunate than
the true Christian spirit.
Yeah, it's a wonderful scene, and it's one of the. I'm trying to think of a depiction of blacks in a major Hollywood motion picture from that era that's more positive, and I'm drawing a blank. So it is great, and when that whole crowd is together watching the cartoon and laughing, and that's when it hits that the lesson that Sullivan was to learn was not about, or just about, the suffering of people, because he's a privileged man, and they have some fun with that at the beginning of the film. But what I'm doing is important, because as he says about making comedies, he goes, it isn't much, but it's better than nothing on this cockeyed caravan. So now we've talked about the end of the film, let's circle back to the beginning.
But it was fitting to start by talking about the end of the film. Do you know why?
Why?
Because the film opens with the end.
The fight on the train.
Yep. And then with the actual, the end, at the end of the movie. So the film opens on the end.
Yeah. Something he does again, by the way, in his film. And this idea of starting with the ending of something else. So we're seeing the end of some movie that I don't know if did did Sullivan direct it, or is
Yeah,
this,
Sullivan directed it.
or is this something that he's showing the other people saying, I want to make something like this? It's a little bit ambiguous.
You're right. That is ambiguous because they have that continued argument about how it's been in.
Oh yeah, you're right.
It's been held over for 5
It's
weeks.
been held over. Yeah. I'm pretty sure he made it.
And so because they're saying, well, you don't know what you're asking to do, and he says, well, if I don't know what I'm asking to do, how's this been held over for 5 weeks?
Yeah. And what is the name of the film he wants to make? This.
Oh, brother, where art thou?
Yes. It's one of the great film references of all time. The Coen brothers love Preston Sturges. They basically took Eddie Bracken and made him Tim Robbins' character in the Hudsucker Proxy, and then they took the whole freaking title of the movie within the movie that's never made about human suffering, and they make it a comedy about human suffering in 2000. So he starts out the film trying to convince his bosses at the studio to let him make this movie about human suffering based on apparently a best-selling book. And they tried to talk him out of it, and one of the executives has this idea that, well, I'll make him realize that he knows nothing about this, and that'll dissuade him. He's like, you're right. I know nothing about this. I need to learn all about it.
I'm going down to costuming. I'm going to get the right costume, and I'm going to set out with 10 cents in my pocket.
So he sets off to do just that.
Well, but first there's that whole exchange where they're trying to convince him to let this press junket follow him. And he's basically telling them off. And as he goes to walk out the room, the executive hands him the summons and says, well, we're taking you to court to show you that we can stop you from doing that and that you can't do it without our junket following along.
Yeah, it's like you're too dead. Because they were talking earlier about we should insure him for $1 million. It's worth more than that.
Yeah.
And they're like, we can't risk it. So they get this, they call it a land yacht.
He calls it a land yacht.
He calls it a land yacht. It's
basically
a bus / motorhome
that's been retrofitted for these accommodations, and
he's got press people, he's got a cook, he's got
plus
a driver and a staff, and they're following him at a short distance as he
is trying to hitchhike
all hobo-like.
They're following him from like less than 50 feet away.
Yeah. So he's traveling around, and this kid in a what's the word I'm looking for?
It's like an early stock car.
It's
the kid calls it a tank, though.
There was a word for it where they take a crappy old car and they spruce it up and
make it a race car.
There's a super common word for it. It's driving me nuts that I can't come up with it. But that's what it is, and he drives by. Well,
but the narrative that the kid tells him is he says, I'm learning how to drive a tank.
Mm-hmm.
Did you catch that?
Yeah. A hot rod.
Okay.
Souped up jalopy, a hot rod. All right, so anyway, the kid in the hot rod stops and picks up Sullivan, and they have this really frantic chase sequence that causes all sorts of long trailer-like chaos inside the land yacht. And then eventually they get stopped, and in all the chaos, they're like, Sullivan, that was a pretty dirty trick for you to pull on us. And it's like, well, I'm going to do it again if you don't give me some space. So here's the deal. Meet me in Las Vegas in 2 weeks. And pretend you were following me around, and then we'll go from there. So that's what he does. And he ends up getting an employee of these 2 spinster women.
Who want to keep him.
They want to keep him. And so he's out with his shirt off, cutting wood, and they put him up in their house, and they literally lock him in his room at night. They take him out to the theater
after they take him to the movies. Were they seeing one of his movies?
I don't know what they were seeing, but it feels like it was a joke on going to a low-rent theater at that time because of all the crying babies and the kids in the background. And it's just he's having a completely unenjoyable theater experience trapped between these 2 women. They take him home. They lock him in his room. He's got to get out of there, so he does the old bed sheets
out the window,
hurts himself, ends up getting on a train and getting...
No, he hitchhikes because he falls in the barrel.
Oh, yes.
And he's hitchhiking, and he gets in the back of the truck with the blanket or whatever, and the guy drops him back in Hollywood, right outside the diner.
No, that's not Hollywood. That's Vegas. It is Las Vegas.
No, Vegas is when he gets off the train.
No, Vegas is when he gets...
Because he's got Veronica Lake with him when he gets off in Vegas.
So no, that's not how I'm remembering it. I'm remembering that as they were... Cause
this is when he meets Veronica Lake.
This is when he meets Veronica Lake. So
he gets out of the back of the truck.
He goes up to that diner. He meets Veronica Lake, who... We'll get back to Veronica Lake. Who is down on her luck, but offers to buy him something for breakfast, ham and eggs. And
in exchange, he's offering to get her a car.
You're right. That is later.
And so they go back to his house.
You're right.
Well, first he goes and gets the car, and then they get pulled over by the police officer, and he has to kind of tell her who he is. And so they go back to his house, and that's when they have the whole pool scene. And yeah, so then they set out again together because she finds out what he's trying to do, and so she wants to come along, and they set out again together. And that's when they get on the train, and when they get off the train, they're in Las Vegas, and they go to the lunch counter in Vegas.
Yeah.
And they have no money to pay for their coffees. And so the counter owner gives them their coffees and gives them both a donut.
Yeah, and he says, I'm never going to get rich. And it's just like he feels sorry for him.
And there's a great scene.
It is a great scene because he's doing a great kindness to him, and then somehow this idea of the land yacht comes up in conversation.
Well, he asks him where he is, and he says,
"Oh yes,
we're in Vegas." And he goes, "Well, have you seen a land yacht around here?"
It's like
and
that
he says,
thing.
That thing, and so they go out and they get in the land yacht, and he sends his employee back in to give the owner of the lunch counter $100 bill.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or no, it's not $100 bill. It's just $100. It's a wad of cash. So, but yeah.
Yeah.
So he finally kind of gets rich.
Yeah, he does kind of get rich for doing that. So very earlier in the picture, when they're having that conversation about making "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" and he wants to make this important story about the human condition, and the joke they keep throwing in with a little sex in it.
Yeah.
And we get that in the form of Miss Veronica Lake, because there's always a girl in the picture, as he says, who is just absolutely wonderful, and she's stunning, and she's a dream girl in this. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the life and times of Veronica Lake, who I assume this was your introduction to her as an actress. You'd heard the name before.
Oh yeah.
And one of the places that more modern audiences would have heard the name is in the movie L.A. Confidential, in which Kim Basinger plays a Veronica Lake type. She's done up to look like her, even though she's far too tall for the part, because Veronica Lake was actually 4'11".
Yeah.
And her peekaboo hairstyle was tremendously popular. It was her trademark. When she got rid of it is when her career started to go downhill, which is kind of ironic. But there's a great scene in a Billy Wilder movie, his directorial debut that came out the following year in 1942, called The Major and the Minor. And there's a sequence in which Ray Milland is a military guy. He's at a military school, and he is chaperoning a junior high school dance. And every girl at the dance has the peekaboo haircut. All these 13-year-old girls trying to look like Veronica Lake. It's an effective gag if you get the reference.
Yeah.
So Veronica Lake was born Constance Frances Marie Ockelman on November the 14th, 1922, in Brooklyn, New York. She is of German and Irish extraction. Her father died in an industrial accident in 1932, but her mother remarried a wealthy man shortly thereafter, and so Veronica went up to Montreal, Quebec for boarding school. But then she returned home when her stepfather had fallen ill. By this point, the family had relocated to Miami, Florida, which is where she graduated from high school. She decided that she wanted to be an actress, and so in 1938 she heads out to Hollywood, and by January of 1939 she is appearing in motion pictures. It took her no time to get discovered. She did...
Which makes it entertaining that she's playing a role where she's having trouble getting discovered.
Yes. So she did some minor films: Dark Keo, Sorority House, All Women Have Secrets, Dancing Coeds, Young as You Feel, and 40 Little Mothers, before she had her big break in a film called I Wanted Wings, in which she played a nightclub singer and introduced the peekaboo hairstyle. And then all of a sudden, she is the next big thing. Sullivan's Travels came out later that same year and just made her a bigger star. She would have further success in This Gun for Hire with Robert Preston and Star Spangled Rhythm. By this point, she of course was at Paramount. Her next and probably second most memorable film after this is I Married a Witch, which came out in 1942, directed by Renee Clare. It's Bewitched. It's basically the plot of Bewitched a couple decades before the sitcom, and she's, perfectly charming in it. She was in The Glass Key, So Proudly We Hail, Star Spangled Rhythm, and then she changed her hairstyle, and her box office started to decline, and she started going down in the billing. So by 1944, she was third billed in a film that I just learned existed and now absolutely need to see, called Out of This World, in which she is paired with Eddie Bracken and Diana Lynn.
Wow.
I know nothing about it other than that's the cast, and I will probably be watching this very soon.
Which is recurring characters we've been discussing.
From the earlier Preston Sturges films. So the decline continued. She was in, probably the last really significant film she was in was called The Blue Dahlia, produced by John Houseman. The Black Dahlia Murders was a play off of that. The man who wrote that film, Raymond Chandler, gave her a nickname on set, Veronica Lake.
Wow.
Yeah, did not care for her, and apparently she was a bit of a terror. I don't know if she was always like that, but she got to have a reputation as being difficult on set, which would have just helped the downward slide. She made a film called Variety Girl in their final years at Paramount, Saigon, Isn't It Romantic, The Sainted Sisters, before being given the kick-out, ending up at 20th Century Fox, made a film called Slattery's Hurricane, and by 1951, she was making cheapo films for Lippert Pictures in Mexico, including a film called Stronghold. Shortly thereafter, the IRS seized her home for unpaid taxes, so she would move back to New York and attempt to do some stage work. She was married 3 times, first to the art director John S. Detail, then to the director Andre de Toth, and finally to the songwriter Joseph Allen McCarthy. All of these marriages ended in divorce. And then her later years were kind of known for a reverse, starting at the top and ending at the bottom kind of situation. So I'm going to read a little bit from Wikipedia. After her third divorce, Lake drifted between cheap hotels in New York City and was arrested several times for public drunkenness and disorderly conduct. In 1962, a New York Post reporter found her living at the all-women's Martha Washington Hotel in Manhattan, working as a waitress downstairs in the cocktail lounge. She was working under the name Connie de Toth. Lake said she took the job in part because I like people, I like to talk to them. The reporter's widely distributed story led to speculation that Lake was destitute. After the story ran, fans of Lake sent her money, which she returned as a matter of pride. Lake vehemently denied that she was destitute and stated, "It's as though people were making me out to be down and out. I wasn't. I was paying $190 a month rent then, and that's a long way from being broke." The story did revive some interest in Lake and led to some television and stage appearances, most notably in the 1963 Off-Way revival of the musical Best Foot Forward. She was a television hostess for old movies in Baltimore for a short while, and she made her last film appearance in a low-budget horror film released in 1970 called Flesh Feast, which was a movie with a Nazi storyline. Lake's memoirs, Veronica, the autobiography of Veronica Lake, which she dictated to the writer Donald Bain, was published in the United Kingdom in 1969 and in the United States the following year. In the book, Lake discusses her career, her failed marriages, her romances with Howard Hughes, Tommy Manville, and Aristotle Onassis, her alcoholism, and her guilt over not spending enough time with her children. In the book, Lake stated to Bain that her mother pushed her into a career as an actress. Bain quoted Lake, looking back at her career, as saying, "I never did cheesecake, like Ann Sheridan or Betty Grable, I just used my hair." She also laughed off the term sex symbol and instead referred to herself as a sex zombie. Miss Lake would pass away in 1973 at the age of 50.
Wow.
From hepatitis and acute kidney injury. So a sad trajectory of a woman that in Sullivan's Travels is just the embodiment of life and youth and energy. So back to our story. So when the land yacht picks them up, Sullivan's gotten kind of sick, and so the doctor, he is a doctor on board, basically forces him to go back to...
You have a minimum of 3 days rest.
Los Angeles.
Well, no, he tells him actually to drive towards Kansas City.
Yes, that they'll drive him to Kansas City.
Yeah.
But in the land yacht so that he can recover. Veronica Lake continues to insist, I'm coming with you. They dress her up like a boy. They hitchhike. They ride the rails. There's some really effective sequences here where they're showing. Some are played for laughs, like the homeless encampment, that as soon as the train starts moving, everybody's running to get on board. But some are more serious, like when they're in the shelter, the way overcrowded.
Well, but it starts before that because they go to that other encampment where they get the lice, and then they go through the delousing showers, and then they're at the church, and that's when he gets his shoes stolen. And, yeah.
And the church situation where they basically have to sit and listen to the minister in exchange for really basic accommodations.
Basically just a roof over their head while they sleep for the night.
Yeah. And he learns, he has that experience. He gets picked back up, head back to Hollywood, and he decides, they've got this whole press thing to kind of tout what he did. And he decides, I'm going to get a bunch of $5 bills, I'm going to go down to the railroad yard, I'm going to hand these out. I used my trusty inflation calculator. A $5 bill in 1940 is equivalent to just under $95 in current. So basically a $100 bill is what he's given out. And that's when the one homeless person spies him again, decides to knock him out, puts him on a train car, and then runs away with his loot. But he trips on the tracks and drops all the money. And as he's gathering it, he's hit by a train.
Yep. And so when Sullivan doesn't show up, they're checking the hospitals, the police station. They send someone to the morgue and they say, there's somebody here that nobody can recognize that was hit by a train. And they said, is there any way to identify him? And that's when they check the shoes and find the card that has been hidden in his shoes. And that's why they think that Sullivan's been killed. Not knowing that his shoes have been stolen in the night.
And Sullivan ends up disoriented, and he gets into that fight where he bloodies a yard dog guy.
A trained employee whose job is basically just to kick the
homeless people out, kick the hobos out. And that takes him to prison and to the climax of the film. We forgot to talk about the subplot about his wife.
Yeah.
So he is married.
Which we find out about when they are... So after they come out of the church, when they go back to their accommodations, Veronica Lake has gotten cleaned up and is coming to talk with him. And they're getting ready to go back, and that's when he tells her that he's married. And she's kind of thinks it's a rude trick because she wants to just continue on with him. And then he explains to her that it was his business manager's idea for him to get married. But it turns out that his wife was in cahoots with his business manager, and it's cost him more money, and she won't grant him the divorce and all this type of stuff.
Yeah, and because they think he's dead, the wife and the business manager get married, which gives him an out when he is discovered to, in fact, not have passed on.
Yep. Well, and it's entertaining because, like, when he's rediscovered, and she tells him and explains to him what's going on, he says, now she has to give me the divorce. And he's talking with his business managers, and they said, now you're free. And he looks at Veronica Lake, and he says, hopefully not for long.
Yeah. Yeah, and you do hope that those two end up together. And they're a wonderful, wonderful couple. And in some of the poster art, when they're not focusing on the peekaboo haircut, there's the picture of the two of them in their bums rags, and he's so much taller than her, and they got the hands around her waist, and I mean that's the iconic image of this film. There's two. There's them in the hobo clothes wandering around the homeless encampments, and then there's the scene in the church at the end. Those are the two great moments. Though in third or fourth place, I'm going to have to give the hot rod chase. That is very kinetic.
Not Veronica Lake getting pulled into the pool.
That is actually great. You're right. That is a great sequence. Now, years ago, I listened to an audio commentary of this when I first saw the film, and the guy that was giving the audio commentary was talking about the staff, the two butlers.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this was intentional or necessarily the way you have to read it, but certainly the way they can be read, that they are gay.
Yeah.
They kind of come across that way. And he talks about in the audio commentary, this film scholar, it's like, that is the great unmade Preston Sturges film. The story of the two gay butlers and trying to keep track of their eccentric employer.
Yeah. Played by Robert Grigg and Eric Bloor, respectively.
We're going to do a little bit of dialogue, because I love Preston Sturges dialogue. So Burroughs, one of our butlers, is talking to Sullivan as Sullivan is getting ready to head out on his hobo gig.
Mm-hmm.
If you will permit me to say so, sir, the subject is not an interesting one. The poor know all about poverty, and only the morbid rich would find the topic glamorous. But I'm doing it for the poor, don't you understand? I doubt if they would appreciate it, sir. They rather resent the invasion of their privacy, I believe quite properly, sir. Also, such excursions can be extremely dangerous, sir. I worked for a gentleman once who, likewise, with two friends, accoutremated themselves as you have, sir, and then went out for a lark. They have not been heard from since. When was that? 1912, sir.
Which does get a reaction from him.
You see, sir, rich people and theorists, who are usually rich people, think of poverty in the negative, as the lack of riches, as disease might be called the lack of health, but it isn't, sir. Poverty is not the lack of anything, but a positive plague, virulent in itself, contagious as cholera, with filth, criminality, vice, and despair, as only few of its symptoms. It is to be stayed away from. Even for purposes of study, it is to be shunned. John L. Sullivan. It's a funny thing how everything keeps shoving me back to Hollywood or Beverly Hills or this monstrosity we're writing in. Almost like gravity, as if some force were saying, get back where you belong. You don't belong out here in the real life, you phony you. Maybe there's a universal law that says, stay put. As you are, so shall you remain. Maybe that's why tramps are always in trouble. They don't vote, they don't pay taxes, they violate the laws of nature, but nothing is going to stop me. I'm going to find out how it feels to be in trouble, without friends, without credit, without checkbook, without name, alone.
I have a couple pieces of interesting trivia for you.
Okay.
One thing you mentioned kind of in passing, but clarifying or adding a little bit to it. This is coming from the trivia section of IMDb. Preston Sturges wrote this film with Joel McCrea in mind, and McCrea was the only actor considered for the role of Sullivan. One you would not have guessed, and I certainly wouldn't have guessed. During the making of the film, Veronica Lake was between 6 and 8 months pregnant.
You could nope.
Production took place from June 12th to July 22nd, 1941, and her daughter Elaine Detley was born on August 21st, 1941.
Wow.
The only other people involved in the production who knew of her condition were the costume designer Edith Head and Preston Sturges' then wife Louise. Head designed costumes to hide the condition. Lake was afraid that she would not be allowed to make the film if her advanced state of pregnancy was revealed owing to the physical demands of the role.
Yeah. And her costuming in this is great.
Yeah.
That white outfit that she's wearing, it's
very flattering.
It's like the outfit you think of Veronica Lake wearing when you think of Veronica Lake.
Yeah. Reportedly, Preston Sturges got the idea for this movie from stories of John Garfield living the hobo life, riding freight trains, and hitchhiking his way across the country for a short period in the 1930s. In his autobiography, Preston Sturges noted that he wrote the film as a reaction to the preaching he found in other comedy films, which seemed to have abandoned the fun in favor of the message. Joel McCrea and Veronica Lake did not get along during filming. McCrea subsequently turned down the lead role in I Married a Witch because he did not want to work with Lake again.
Wow.
They did, however, appear together again in Ramrod in 1947. Oh, and this was one I had made a note of, but I hadn't mentioned yet. The dedication for this film was intriguing. The film's opening dedication says, quote, "To the memory of those who made us laugh, the motley Monty backs, the clowns, the buffoons, and all times and nations, whose efforts have lightened our burden a little, This picture is affectionately dedicated, with the added phrase, in this cockeyed caravan, end quote. Was initially to be spoken by Joel McCrea in the epilogue, as if it was to be the prologue for the comedy he intended to make. In the original script, the prologue Preston Sturges initially wrote was, "This is the story of a man who wanted to wash an elephant. The elephant damn near ruined him." Yeah, I thought those were some interesting tidbits.
So it's presented as obviously a negative thing, him moving from comedy into more serious things because his gift was in comedy. He does make that comment early on about, so you want to make a Frank Capra. It's like, well, what's wrong with Capra? There is somebody that did what Sullivan intended to do very effectively, and that was a man that Joel McCrea worked with in the comedy The More the Merrier, George Stevens. George Stevens was a great comedy director. Alice Adams, The More the Merrier. The one about the housing shortage during the war, that's title I'm forgetting. And then he went to serve in the war in the Signal Corps, and he photographed concentration camps being liberated.
Wow.
And he comes back, and he never makes another comedy. He goes to drama. He made A Place in the Sun. He made my favorite film, Giant. He made The Diary of Anne Frank and The Greatest Story Ever Told. And he just couldn't do it anymore after that experience.
Yeah, I could see why.
So, this movie was a success, obviously. Let's see if I can find some more particulars on that.
I looked for it on my screen and I couldn't find it, so...
It was made for a budget of $678,000 and made 1.2 million U.S. rentals. So a little under twice what it cost.
I'm sure
so
the
not a huge
residuals
success.
have to have.
Yeah, over the years, it's such a classic that I'm sure it's been pulling in money since then. It is tremendously well remembered and was well reviewed. It has a 100% score on Rotten Tomatoes.
Does it?
I believe a 7.8 on IMDb, which is pretty high for IMDb.
Yes, 7.9 on IMDb.
7.9.
I would rate this film 4 stars on the 4-star scale, and I'm going to give it 9 stars on the 10-star scale. I'm holding back the 1 star for the middle runs a little bit long. It opens pretty good, the middle is a little bit long, and then it redeems itself in the ending.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's definitely a 4-star film. I almost want to give it 9.5, but I'd probably give it a 9 out of 10. It's just wonderful. It's very much a film of its time, but it's also still resonates.
Oh yeah.
So it's a great portrait. It's Sturges really stretching himself and doing something kind of different from what else he had done. He would write screenplays for some dramatic films.
It's not that different though. I mean that's kind of the through. There's kind of a through line in the films we've watched thus far, and that they are in the way that humor's employed.
Yeah.
They are pretty similar.
He's commenting. I guess he's commenting on it more
though.
overtly here than elsewhere. But you're right. There's always a tinge of darkness in the Sturges films. Probably even more so than in Wilder. Wilder was cynical, but I don't think he was as despairing as Sturges could be at times. So this is an excellent film. Highly recommend seeking it out.
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
And we will return next week with our final offering of Preston Sturges Month.
Yep, and I'm Rob.
And I'm Nate.
And this is Rob and Nate Record a Podcast. Did you find it in the recesses?
I did not.
You got nothing for me, huh?
Oh, I'll come up with something. You'll get so much more with your happy motoring store. It's Esso. It's Esso.
I feel like I should know that.
It's antiquated jingle to tie in with last week's new post-war old style.
I forgot about it. Well, at least you're consistent.
Yeah.
Did you have that written in your notes?
Part of it.
Well, I meant like basically to do it. Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
Fun stuff.
This is going to be a long one.
Well, there was a couple gaps. interesting stuff on Veronica Lake and how apparently she was so hard to work with.
Yeah.
Their chemistry, though, on screen in this,
You would have thought that they were just
good friends.
Yeah.
I mean, they on screen they appear like they genuinely are the best of friends. And so I was a little bit surprised to read that.
Yeah. Yeah,
So.
it's kind of sad that like she could have had a different life, I think, if she had been more pleasant.
Yeah.
More
Well, and to read that she was pregnant, like I never would have guessed that.
Yeah, I was surprised.
Yeah. Yep.
I was, even before they said that, I'm like, well, man, Edith could dress. I mean, she's a great costume designer, but man, could she dress Veronica Lake? That's
Yeah.
like
I mean, to hide that.
everything that she wore in that film is just fantastic looking.
Yeah.
Even the hobo clothes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, even when she's trying to paint her face.